All right, so let's talk about what happens after Charles the Great Charlemagne dies. And what we're going to see is the story of the last few of the Frankish rulers. But in the process of looking at this, we're also going to talk about a really cool event, something called the Oath of Strasbourg, which is going to shape much of what we think of modern Western Europe, even. And you'll see what I mean by that as we go through this quick short lecture on the kind of end of the Frankish kingdom. So after Charles the Great dies, he's going to be replaced by his son Louis the Pious. He's going to be crowned by the Pope, Pope Stephen IV, and there's some details about his reign. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail at all about the reign of Louis the Pious, other than tell you that there was some conflicts or some kind of civil wars taking place during his time, but at the end of the day, he maintained his empire. He continued the Carolingian Renaissance, and all of that part, despite some of the conflicts, the empire maintained itself. What's, of course, going to be really important about Louis the Pious is what happens when he dies and what he's going to do. Because when he dies, he has three sons. And this is the part of the story that's really important, what I want to focus on here. So let's look at our next map. When he dies, he takes his three sons, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German, and Lothar, right? Or no, Lothar. And you can see I didn't put Louis the German here on the key words there, but you obviously want to get him down. And there's going to be a war between them, not a surprise. Eventually, it's going to be down to Charles the Bald and Louis the German. And when it's down to those two, there's different things can happen. Are these two going to continue to fight in another civil war? Are they going to decide to unify and rule together? Or do they take another option? And the option they decide to do is to meet at a city called Strasbourg in 842 and take the Oath of Strasbourg. And I'll explain all these other names here in a second if you're already looking at them. And they take the Oath of Strasbourg. And what the Oath of Strasbourg essentially is each of these men, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, those are the two who are going to take this oath, honoring the land of the others. But what's interesting about this is that Charles the Bald is going to take this oath to Louis the German in a language that he and his people would understand, an early kind of form of the German language. And Louis the German is going to take the same oath to Charles the Bald in a language his people would understand. Now, if you look at, just a map here, and we kind of slice this area almost in half, and obviously this is an exact over here, and we think of this as being kind of modern day France, and this is modern day Germany. Again, not exact, I know. What we end up having is between the Oath of Strasbourg and the territory, the split that essentially creates what will be France and Germany. And so this is what's going to end up happening that gets us these two nations, that if you think about it, have had so many wars, but really start off as two brothers. And so what ends up happening is in the East, the kingdom of Louis the German, let me just talk about that briefly, is going to continue on. And very often this is what we call, sometimes ends up becoming the Holy Roman Empire, which there's a joke that says it's not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. And of course, if you know much about the history of Germany from that period on until modern times, it kind of comes apart, falls together, comes apart, falls together. And so for a while, it's a bunch of independent states, and then eventually comes united, and all these different events of it. And so I'm not going to really talk about that beyond saying that, for now, that's what we're going to see here in the East. In the West, after Charles the Bald dies, he's going to be replaced by his son, Charles the Fat. And we see these nicknames. So he's called Charles the Bald, and we have Charles the Fat. And people wonder, was he really called Charles the Fat? And some, again, people say this was a name he got later. Same thing with Charles the Bald. Was he really bald or not? And then you get even another one after him called Charles the Simple. And Charles the Simple, this is very interesting because I've seen very disputed accounts on this. Again, most of this comes from later, not from his life. But simple as in he was like just to the point simple, or simple as in he was not too bright simple, and made terrible mistakes. And so those kind of different interpretations of where these nicknames mean. But again, I remember kind of going through this when I was a student, and the kind of the running joke was if you start looking at all the nicknames, we went from Charles the Hammer, if you remember, to then we had Pippin the Short and Charles the Great, and then we go to Louis the Pious, the Bald, the Fat, the Simple, and people are going, well, things aren't going well. But eventually, what will happen is by the time we get to about the 900s, the Frankish kingdom in the West is no longer going to be run by the Carolingians and what we think of as the Frankish kingdom, France, right? And we're going to see this new dynasty, the Capetians, eventually take over. I'm not going to go into lectures on that. You don't need to worry about all that, but I definitely want you to know for this lecture, the most important thing to get out of it is that Oath of Strasbourg and how you get this division that will eventually give us France and Germany. So that's basically it, as long as you kind of understand that and the split and everything else we've been talking about in terms of the Frankish kingdom, especially, of course, Charles the Great, most important part of our whole story, but everything going back to Clovis is what you'll obviously want to know and include for your quizzes, any essay exams you might have on it. It's all very important. All right, so I hope all that's clear. If you have any questions, just let me know. All right, everyone have a great day. Thank you.